Hi everyone, you are on the channel that shows forbidden BL stories. You cannot pause once you start. This is a story about a cold alpha who swore he would never have a family until two twin boys at a crowded party chose him as the safest scent in the room and made it impossible to hide who their father really was. Do not forget to support the channel with a like and a subscription so you do not miss new forbidden BL stories that hit too close to the heart. Write in the comments which city you are watching this video from. Damien Vale had built his entire life on a single rule. Nothing and no one would ever own him again. Not a corporation, not a mate bond, and certainly not a family. In a world where alphas were expected to collect partners and heirs like trophies, he became the quiet exception that irritated everyone. He was a cold, precise corporate alpha, the kind whose name opened doors and whose presence silenced rooms. He was also the one who could look straight into a camera at a business interview and say, without blinking, "Children are a liability," and make it sound like a simple market fact, not a confession. His mornings showed the same philosophy. He woke in a penthouse that looked more like a high-end hotel suite than a home. Clean lines, muted colors, no photographs on the walls, no handmade gifts cluttering shelves. Clothes were arranged by function, not memory. The kitchen was stocked with things that kept, not things that reminded him of anyone. When he crossed the polished floor to make coffee, the only footprints on the day were his own. People around him tried to rationalize it. Some whispered about childhood trauma. Others said he was simply too ambitious to be distracted. Damien did not correct them. He let them build their own explanations because it kept them from asking questions that went too deep. He moved through his life like through a carefully designed corridor. Penthouse, boardrooms, hotel lobbies, private cars. Everything was optimized for control. No toys scattered on floors, no small hands grabbing at his clothes, no uncertain days rearranged around someone else's needs. He remembered, without wanting to, what those needs had looked like in his own childhood home. A father who measured worth in achievement charts pinned to the fridge. A mother who treated any sign of weakness as a personal insult. Family dinners where silence was safer than honesty. Birthdays that felt like performance reviews. That house had smelled of polished wood, expensive wine, and fear. There had been no soft spaces, only corners where punishment waited. When people said, "Family is everything," he still heard, "You belong to us, and you owe us." So when friends from his younger years began to post pictures with strollers and soft blankets, he watched from a distance with a kind of detached relief. The same men who had once joked about never settling down now talked about sleep schedules and daycare. Women who had once matched him, drink for drink at networking events, now bowed out early because of bedtime routines. Messages that used to arrive at midnight stopped at 9 in the evening, replaced by photos of tiny hands gripping adult fingers. "Cute," someone would say, pushing a phone under his nose. Damien would glance, nod politely, and hand it back. Inside, something in him tightened, not out of envy, but out of recognition of the invisible chains curling around these people. Nights cut short, choices narrowed without anyone daring to admit it, careers rerouted around school pickups and sick days. He did not judge them. He just refused to join them. Offers had come and gone. High-profile omegas, matching his status, suggested contracts that were more merger than romance. Agencies tried to lure him into curated matches with carefully screened partners. He listened, signed where it benefited his firm, and walked away where it threatened his autonomy. At one point, in his early 20s, when money was tighter and his hatred of obligation was even sharper, he had briefly signed up as a donor at a high-end clinic. The clinic had been all glass and soft voices, discreet hallways and neutral art. They had shown him a contract that turned his genetics into a simple transaction, payment on one side, complete release of parental rights on the other. The counselor had explained that some omegas preferred anonymous donors with strong profiles, that he would never be contacted. That any children, if they appeared, would exist in a separate world, sealed off by confidentiality agreements. He had signed for reasons that were more cynicism than desire. It was a way to prove to himself that blood and heredity meant nothing without consent. They can have my DNA, he had thought, but they will never have me. Afterwards, he never thought about it again. For him, that sample was just another line item in a long list of things he had given away in exchange for cash and freedom as a younger man. Years passed. The zeros in his accounts multiplied. His name began to appear on industry lists and business magazines. Assistants learned that sending him family-themed invitations was pointless. Event planners stopped asking if he would be bringing a +1. He arrived alone, left alone, and in between played his role with mechanical precision, the efficient, elegant alpha who belonged to nothing but his work. Whenever someone joked that one day even he would soften, Damien responded with the same cool half-smile and the same internal vow. There would be no partner who could negotiate their way inside his walls, no child whose crying could dictate his sleep, no small body that could reach into his chest and rewire all his priorities. The past had already made sure he knew what it felt like to be trapped in someone else's idea of family. He had spent too long breaking out of that cage to willingly step back inside. Not me, he would think, watching colleagues hurry home to bath time and bedtime stories. Never me. He had no idea that two small boys with matching eyes and a familiar undertone in their scent were already growing up somewhere in the same city, learning to navigate the world by instinct. He could not know that on a night that started like any other corporate gala, they would walk straight through all the locked doors he had built and choose him, without hesitation, as the safest place in the room. Across the city, in a cramped third-floor walk-up that smelled of detergent, instant noodles, and the faint sweetness of children's shampoo, an Omega named Evan was trying to keep his life from collapsing. His days began long before dawn, in that blue hour when the streetlights were still on and the city had not yet remembered its own noise. He would stand for a second in the narrow kitchen, palms flat on the counter, and pull in one steadying breath before the routine started. Breakfast came first. Toast from the cheapest bread, cut into small squares that Theo would actually eat. Scrambled eggs thinly stretched with milk, because protein had to go further than the carton said it should. 2 small lunchboxes lined up on the table like promises he was afraid to break. He wrote their names on the lids with a marker that was starting to dry out. Theo on one, Jamie on the other, same letters, different chaos inside. Then came the most delicate part of the morning, waking 2 5-year-old boys who never wanted to wake at the same time. Jamie, all restless limbs and big ideas, usually bolted upright the second he smelled food, tumbling out of the bed he shared with his brother, leaving socks, stuffed animals, and half-folded blankets in his wake. "I am not tired," he would announce even as he stumbled. Theo, sensitive to every sound and smell, burrowed deeper into the pillow when Evan whispered his name, clinging to him when he finally managed to coax him upright, small fingers hooked in the collar of Evan's old T-shirt. It always cost time he did not have. Jamie needed to be redirected every few minutes, away from building towers out of cereal boxes and toward actually getting dressed. Theo needed the lights dimmed, the volume of the kettle turned into a soft background hum, the shirt with the right texture, not the one that felt wrong. Every preference was a small negotiation. Every negotiation meant another minute shaved off Evan's own preparation. Evan had not planned to become a parent like this. Years earlier, sitting in a quietly lit office at a fertility clinic, he had listened to a doctor explain the options for single omegas. The room had smelled of antiseptic and expensive coffee. On the screen, donor profiles slid past, each reduced to height, education, medical history, and a handful of carefully neutral adjectives: athletic, reliable, driven, safer words standing in for people he would never meet. One profile had stood out without any clear reason: an anonymous alpha donor with a clean health record, strong cardiovascular markers, and a curt note at the bottom that he was not interested in future contact. That line had felt like a shield. Evan, burned by past relationships that had begun with soft promises and ended with slammed doors, had read those words and thought, good. No one to show up later and decide he had changed his mind. No one to claim space in their lives and then vanish again. A faceless donor, he told himself, meant less pain. Pregnancy had not gone as planned. His supportive employer turned out to be supportive only in words on a company handbook. Shifts at his event planning job were cut without warning, then offered back at odd hours that clashed with prenatal appointments. Colleagues started saying things like, "You will understand once you have the baby," while simultaneously scheduling meetings at times he physically could not attend. Friends who had once talked about being godparents or helping with night feeds quietly disappeared into their own routines, answering messages later and later until silence became the default. He had carried the twins mostly alone, wrapping his arms around his belly at night in a small rented room and bargaining with the future in whispers. "Stay," he would ask, the tiny fluttering weight under his hands. "Stay safe, stay healthy, I will figure it out." When the boys were finally born and the hospital placed them in his arms, they smelled like something clean and new in a world that had already taught him too much disappointment. For a few hours, surrounded by beeping machines and harsh lights, he had allowed himself to believe that love might be enough to fill in everything he did not have. Now, 5 years later, every day was a balancing act performed on not enough sleep and too much responsibility. Evan worked as an assistant for an event company, taking whatever jobs he could fit between preschool drop-offs, pickups, and bedtime routines. He answered emails while stirring soup, typed out client proposals with one child asleep on his lap and the other humming quietly on the floor, lining toy cars up in careful patterns. He tried not to look too long at the growing stack of bills on the kitchen counter, as if ignoring the numbers would keep them from multiplying. Their third-floor apartment was held together by tape and habit. There was a crack in the bedroom window that whistled when the wind hit it just right. The hot water ran out too quickly. The hallway light flickered, casting their morning rush in brief, stuttering frames. Yet within these imperfect walls, Evan and the twins had built a fragile kind of safety. He told the boys that their family was just different, not incomplete. 3 people instead of the stories with 4 or 5. When Theo asked where their other parent was, Evan used simple phrases about a kind alpha who had helped them be born but did not live with them. The donor in the clinic file remained a blank space in his mind. Evan had deliberately refused all options for future contact. No letters held by the clinic, no photographs to be released when the children came of age. He believed that keeping the line clean would save his children and himself from complicated entanglements, from a future where someone appeared out of nowhere and decided to rearrange their lives. Genetics, he thought, could be treated like paperwork if he was firm enough about it. Sign here, file away, forget. He had no way of knowing that this decision did not delete the donor from their story. Genetics did not respect emotional contracts. Somewhere in the same city, the man whose quiet file he had once clicked on moved through his own sterile routines, unaware that 2 boys with his eyes were learning to choose safety by scent alone. Jamie was already starting to mirror expressions Evan had never seen on his own face. Theo's stillness sometimes looked like a photograph of someone Evan could not quite place, little echoes of a stranger woven into the boys he had raised with his own hands. In the margins of Evan's carefully scheduled life, small cracks had begun to show. Preschool teachers, well-meaning and tired, hinted that it would be nice to see another adult at events, someone who could split parent-teacher meetings or take a turn on volunteer days. Medical forms left a blank space clearly labeled second parent, and the empty line felt heavier every time he signed just his own name. Systems assumed a structure he did not have. Emails started with, "Dear Parents," as if the plural were automatic. He patched every crack the only way he knew how, with extra hours of work, borrowed energy, and more gentle explanations for the boys. "We are enough," he would murmur when Jamie asked why other kids had more adults clapping at school performances. "We are small, but we are strong." It seemed just manageable, as long as nothing extraordinary happened, as long as no one pushed too hard on the fragile architecture of their days. The extraordinary, however, was already circling their lives in the form of one cold alpha who thought he had successfully opted out of all of this. Evan did not know it yet, but their leftover time, those stolen minutes between shifts and bedtime stories, was about to collide with someone else's carefully guarded freedom, and nothing in his color-coded calendar could prepare him for that impact. The night everything shifted started as just another job for Evan. On paper it was simple. A charity gala, a prestigious firm, a clear contract. The event company he worked for had landed a lucrative client, the kind whose logo looked good on a portfolio and whose feedback could make or break future bookings. The brief was clear and exhausting. There would be donors who expected to be recognized on site, cameras searching for flattering angles, delicate egos to protect, and no margin for visible error. Evan was supposed to be there from early afternoon until well past midnight, running on caffeine and adrenaline, managing last-minute changes, coordinating waitstaff, and making sure the lighting made everyone look just a little better than in real life. Childcare was always the hardest part, the fragile hinge on which every plan swung. His usual sitter fell sick 2 days before the event, voice hoarse with apologies. The preschool announced a scheduled deep cleaning day, shutting its doors with cheerful emails that did nothing to help parents scrambling for backup. Relatives were far away and distant in more ways than geography. He checked every contact in his phone, every neighbor, every acquaintance who had ever said, "If you ever need help, just call." One by one, the answers came back as regrets. When the last backup option failed, the only remaining choice was the one he hated most. Take the twins with him for the first part of the evening and hope they could sleep in a quiet corner until a friend finished her late shift and came to pick them up. It was a bad plan, built on hope and thin margins, but it was the only one that stood between them and missing rent. The venue was a hotel ballroom that had been transformed into something aspirational. Soft gold light washed over mirrored surfaces. Tall arrangements of white flowers towered over crisp tablecloths. Waiters moved like a rehearsed choreography, carrying trays of champagne and tiny, carefully constructed appetizers that cost more per bite than Evan spent on groceries in a day. High above, a crystal chandelier scattered light across sharp suits and carefully chosen gowns, making everything look like a scene from a life he knew he would never have. He arrived early with the boys, their small hands looped through his. The contrast between their worn jackets and the polished marble floor made him want to turn around and leave, but there was no room in his budget for pride. A sympathetic colleague showed him a quieter lounge area off the main hall, a space with plush chairs, low lighting, and a television mounted on the wall that no one planned to use. It was as close to a safe corner as this glittering machine could offer. Evan spread out their small world on a coffee table, coloring books soft from use, a cup filled with mismatched crayons, noise-dampening headphones he had saved up for when he realized how much crowded spaces overwhelmed Theo. He knelt in front of them, smoothing a hand over messy hair, straightening a collar that would be wrinkled again in minutes. "You stay here," he said quietly. "This is your little island. No wandering, no exploring. I will come back every few minutes. If you need me, you stay right here and wait. Promise." Two small heads nodded, eyes wide and serious in a way that made his chest ache. From their corner, the twins watched the party unfold through gaps in the plants and furniture. Theo pressed his shoulder into the back of the armchair, headphones cupped around his neck like a safety net he could pull up at any moment. Jamie leaned forward, elbows on knees, absorbing every detail with restless attention. They observed the flow of people like a private wildlife documentary. They categorized strangers by tone of voice, by nervous laughter, by the way their scents shifted when they lied or tried too hard. For Omegas born into a world that responded to scent as much as to words, the crowded room was an overwhelming storm of signals, layers of perfume and cologne failing to mask the undercurrent of stress, ambition, boredom. Evan slipped into his working rhythm, the one that made clients call him reliable and indispensable. He checked table numbers, adjusted centerpieces by a fraction of an inch, soothed a speaker whose slides refused to load, redirected a florist away from last-second redesigns. His phone buzzed with updates. Staff in earpieces asked quiet questions. Every few minutes, like a metronome in the back of his mind, a thought pulsed. Check on them. He would excuse himself from conversations, cut across the hall, peek into the lounge. 2 small figures, 2 steady breaths. "You good?" A thumbs up from Jamie, a faint smile from Theo. Relief, then back into the current. Damien arrived later, with the cool timing of someone who knew the event would wait for him. The rotating doors parted, and he stepped through in a tailored black suit, indifferent to the way heads turned. His scent, restrained but unmistakably alpha, cut through the mix of fragrances in the air like a clean line. Colleagues greeted him with practiced warmth. Cameras tracked his movements, hungry for a few seconds of footage. His presence at the gala was both a guarantee of media attention and a reminder of the firm's ruthless efficiency. He had no intention of staying long. Appear, be seen, sign what needed signing, accept a few handshakes, and leave before the night dissolved into small talk and diluted drinks. From the lounge corner, two pairs of young eyes noticed him without knowing who he was. To the twins, he was just another tall figure at first, another dark suit in a sea of them. But his scent threaded differently through the room, carrying a steadiness that did not spike with anxiety or greed. They did not have words for it yet. They only felt that somewhere out there was a signal that did not hurt. The chain of accidents that changed everything began with something small, as it always did. During one of Evan's rushed trips back to the ballroom, a server bumped into another at the narrowest point between tables. A tray wobbled, glasses clinked together, champagne spilled in bright arcs onto polished floor. Someone laughed too loudly to cover their irritation. A manager snapped a name, voice sharp. Another staff member swung around to fetch cleaning supplies, hip catching the edge of the lounge door and pushing it open a little wider than before. Jamie's attention snapped to the sound of breaking rhythm. The lounge, safe but dull, suddenly felt too quiet compared to the whirl of movement outside. He slid off the chair, curiosity already outrunning caution. Just a peek, he might have told himself, even if he did not say it out loud. Theo hesitated, fingers tightening on a crayon, but the swirl of scents from the doorway grew stronger, a dizzying mosaic that tugged at his senses. Boredom, curiosity, and the natural pull toward the larger pack of bodies out there collided in their small bodies. For a brief, crucial moment, the lounge was unmonitored. The colleague who had promised to keep an eye on them had been called to the kitchen to deal with a supply issue. The security guard at the end of the corridor had turned his head to scan a different angle. Evan, across the hall, was kneeling by a sound technician, checking cables. No one saw two small figures slip through the half-open entrance to the main hall, hands brushing against each other for balance. In theory, the gala was one of the safest possible places in the city. Badges were checked, guest lists were controlled, security guards stood at each entrance with unobtrusive vigilance. In reality, it was also a labyrinth for two small bodies, a maze of identical round tables, moving legs, heavy tablecloths that turned corners into hiding spots, and adult conversations that rose and fell like waves of meaningless sound. The twins moved forward, swallowed by fabric and noise, their heads barely reaching the level of most people's waists. When Evan returned to the lounge and saw empty chairs and abandoned coloring books, the air fled his lungs in one violent rush. For a second, his brain refused to process the scene, as if the image in front of him were a trick of light. Then, the world narrowed to a single fact. They were gone. The noise of the gala became a muffled roar in his ears. The carefully built schedule, the client's expectations, the fear of losing this job, all of it fell away under the weight of a larger terror. Somewhere in the shimmering hall, his children were alone, two small omega bodies in a crowd that could crush them without even noticing. "No," he whispered, the word leaving his mouth like a prayer and a warning at once. He dropped his clipboard, papers scattering across the carpet, and stepped back into the ballroom, heart pounding. It did not matter how many security measures were in place. He knew how quickly panic could turn even the most polished room into a trap, and how easily two little boys could disappear in a sea of adults who were not looking for them. For Theo and Jamie, the ballroom at floor level was a forest of chair legs and suit trousers. Tablecloths hung down like heavy curtains, brushing their hair and shoulders when they squeezed past. The carpet, patterned in swirling gold, tilted and blurred under their feet as the noise pressed in from all sides. They moved together instinctively, Jamie slightly ahead, Theo clutching the back of his brother's sleeve so hard his knuckles whitened. Their world narrowed to one primitive instruction: find something that felt like safety. Adults used words like vibes and first impressions. For small omegas, the language was different. Safety was the way certain scents brushed against their skin instead of stabbing at it. It was the tone of a heartbeat nearby, the cadence of a voice that made their own heartbeats slow down instead of slam against their ribs. Most adults at the gala smelled wrong. Too sharp with alcohol, too chaotic with nervous sweat, too layered with artificial fragrance trying to hide stress. The twins passed clusters of guests, briefly pausing at the edges of conversations, then moving on, small faces tightening at notes of impatience or aggression hidden under polite laughter. A woman whose perfume burned Theo's nose barked a laugh that made Jamie flinch. A man's cologne was so heavy it clung to them after they walked by, making Theo's stomach dip. They were too low to see faces clearly, but they saw hands, hands that gestured too fast, fingers tapping against glass stems, knuckles gone white around phones. Every jitter, every quick inhale, every forced smile told them the same thing. Not here. Not this one. Not safe. The longer they stayed in the open, the more the room swelled with sensation. Voices rose and fell like ocean waves. Cutlery chimed. A microphone screeched briefly in the distance, and Theo's shoulders slammed up around his ears. His grip on Jamie's sleeve became almost painful. Panic hovered just at the edge, the thin point where freezing in place or bursting into tears both felt equally possible. Then a scent reached them that cut through the noise like a clear tone through static. It was not warm in the conventional sense. It did not wrap around them like a blanket. Damien's scent had always been controlled, clipped, cool like steel left in shade, a clean, restrained alpha presence that said he did not spill anything he did not intend to. But underneath that restraint there was something steady, a grounded note of focus, of promises kept to himself at least. No sour edge of fear, no jagged spike of anger. To adults, this read as confidence with a hint of intimidation, the scent of a man used to having rooms bend around his decisions. To two young Omegas who had grown up learning to read danger quickly, it felt like the one unmoving pillar in a room full of shifting sands. They both turned almost in unison, like needles in a compass swinging toward north. Jamie followed the line of that scent through the forest of legs and fabric, weaving between people without consciously thinking about the path. Theo's heart slowed by half a beat with every step closer. The roaring in his ears eased just enough for him to keep moving. Damien, standing near a cluster of partners discussing a contract, felt the shift before he understood it. A light pressure brushed his leg, then remained. He glanced down, expecting to see a fallen napkin or a stray bag. Instead, he found one boy pressed firmly against his side, small fingers curling into the fabric of his suit trousers like they had every right to be there. A second child half hid behind him, using his tall frame as if it were a wall built exactly for this purpose. For a heartbeat, his mind refused to catalog what he was seeing. Alpha instincts, honed over years of ignoring them, flared anyway. Two small Omega bodies, too close to the center of a crowd, anchoring themselves to the strongest presence they could find. His scent wrapped around them automatically, a subtle shift that had nothing to do with intention and everything to do with biology. Across the room, conversations continued. Glasses clinked, a presenter laughed into a microphone, donors compared vacations. Dozens of eyes slid over the scene without truly registering it. No one understood that something irreversible had just changed in the geometry of the night. The boys did not know his name. They did not know who he was to the firm or to the city. They knew only that standing next to him made the room stop spinning. The thud of his heartbeat, calm and measured, anchored the chaotic rhythm around them. Their bodies, wound tight by too many scents and sounds, began to let go. Shoulders loosened, breathing slowed. Jamie's fingers relaxed fractionally on the fabric under his hand. Theo, half hidden, pressed his forehead briefly to the back of Damien's knee, as if checking that the ground was still there. For Damien, long unused to anyone seeking his presence without calculation, the sensation of tiny hands trusting him on instinct was foreign and unwelcome. This was not a board member asking for a favor, not a rival testing his limits, not a partner gaming for leverage. These were children whose nervous systems had wordlessly decided, this one, here, safe. His first conscious thought was, this should not be happening. The second came from somewhere deeper, older, protect. His muscles reacted before his mind did. He shifted slightly, adjusting his stance so that his body became a barrier between them and the flow of the crowd. Without thinking, he took half a step back toward a column, giving them more cover. He planted his feet in a way he usually saved for negotiations, weight balanced, ready to push back if anything came too close. He found himself tracking movement at the edges of his vision, cataloging exits, noting anyone walking in their direction. Easy, he breathed, more to his own instincts than to them, voice barely audible over the music. Somewhere on the other side of the hall, Evan pushed through guests, calling his son's names in a voice raw with a fear that no one else seemed to register. The crowd heard only another anxious parent at a big event. Staff tried to be helpful, but did not understand the edge in his movements, the way his eyes cut through decor and faces alike, searching. Security began to scan exits, but the room was large and there were too many corners. The twins had already made their choice. They did not run to the nearest bar or grab at a waiter's apron. They had gone straight, on instinct alone, to the one alpha in the room whose scent resonated with something deep in their bones. When Evan finally saw them, nestled against a tall figure in a black suit near one of the central tables, relief hit him first, sharp enough to make his knees weak. He almost sagged in place, lungs dragging in air that burned. They were standing, they were breathing, they were not crying. Then recognition arrived, late and devastating. His gaze climbed from small shoulders to broad back, to the familiar line of a neck he had never seen this close, but had once studied in a sterile clinic file. Even blurred, that old donor photograph had shown a certain angle of jaw, a certain way the mouth held tension. Here it was in front of him, in focus, attached to a man whose scent was now wrapped around his children like a second skin. His heart lurched. The donor number he had clicked years ago now had a human outline and a pair of steady eyes. The man who hated families stood in the center of a glittering ballroom, with two boys pressed trustingly against him, bodies molded to his side as if they had always known where he was. In that moment, hiding the truth became not just difficult, but nearly impossible. Genetics, which Evan had tried to treat like paperwork, had stepped out into the light, breathing and undeniable, with one large hand hovering just above the twins' heads as if ready to catch them if they fell. Later, when he tried to replay that night in his head, Evan remembered it in broken frames, like a film that kept catching on the reel. The exact angle of Damien's shoulders as he turned toward him, controlled and precise, even in confusion. The way the twins' fingers tightened in the fabric of the black suit when the alpha shifted, refusing to let go as if gravity itself had moved with him. The brief hush in the closest circle of guests, a ripple of stunned curiosity as a few people realized something was happening that did not fit the usual gala script. For a few seconds, the world narrowed to a single strip of carpet between them. On one end, Evan, chest heaving, heart hammering against his ribs, tie crooked from pushing through the crowd. On the other end, Damien, immaculately dressed, pupils slightly blown, with two small boys anchored to his side like they had always belonged there. Everything else blurred: the music, the clink of glasses, the soft murmur of money and influence. The clinic had promised anonymity. Years ago, in that pale room with the humming air conditioning, the donor file had shown only abstract data: age, heritage, health markers, intelligence scores, genetic risk factors. The photo attached to it had been deliberately blurred, a suggestion of jaw and hairline and nothing more. Evan had told himself that this was safer, that he did not need to know the details of a stranger's face to build a family. Now, standing close enough to see the exact color of Damien's eyes and the shape of his mouth, he knew without needing a test. The boy's hair had the same dark undertone that looked almost black indoors and softened to brown under warm light. The angle of their brows, the line of their noses, even the way they held their hands when uncertain, echoed this man in front of him. Genetics had stamped its quiet signature into bone and muscle years ago. Tonight it was simply revealing what it had already done. His mind scrambled for denial and found none. He remembered the blurred photograph in the file, the short line at the bottom that had said "not interested in future contact." He remembered how that had felt like safety. Now, that same line felt like a thin joke. The anonymous alpha he had chosen for distance was standing within arm's reach, and his scent was wrapped around Evan's children because they had pulled it over themselves like a shield. Damien, for his part, had never expected the clinic to mean anything in his real life. Back then, at 23, the decision to become a donor had been a pure financial transaction. He had sat in a different sterile office, listened to a different calm voice explain legal protections, and signed away parental rights without reading every subclause. Money in one column, genetic material in another. He had taken the payment and used it to cover rent, debts, and a few months of breathing room. He had assumed that whatever children were conceived from that sample would be distant, anonymous, forever separated from him by layers of confidentiality. Those hypothetical lives belonged to a different timeline, one he had politely declined. He had pictured them as abstract numbers on a report, never as real small bodies with matching scents pressing into his side in the middle of a ballroom. He certainly had not prepared for the sight of two boys whose scent harmonized with his own in a way that biology understood before his conscious mind could catch up. In the quiet zone, just beyond the main crowd, someone from security finally arrived. A manager appeared at their elbow, all professional concern and well-trained calm. Staff members spoke in smooth, practiced tones about lost children and how fortunate it was that they had been found quickly. They tried to fold the moment back into the evening, to make it just another small story in a safe event. To them, this was an incident to be resolved, a risk managed. For Evan, the scene felt like the beginning of a storm. He could see Damien's brain moving behind that controlled expression. The Alpha's gaze flicked between the boys' faces, their matching features, the way their small hands refused to let go of his suit, and then to Evan himself, taking in the tired lines under his eyes, the cheap fabric of his shirt, the way his shoulders curved as if from years of carrying more weight than he was built for. Two boys, clearly twins, clearly Omegas, clearly physically and scent-wise connected to him. One Omega parent who looked like he had not slept properly in years. A story hidden somewhere between them. Most alphas, confronted with such a reality, would have led with anger, shock, or denial. They might have raised their voices, demanded explanations, accused, pushed the children away in panic. Damien's version of shock looked different. His expression barely changed. If anything, it became more precise. But his questions sharpened like the edge of a blade. How old? Not shouted, just pressed. Which clinic? What year? Without raising his voice, he began to gather facts, each word tightening the net around a truth that could no longer be filed under theoretical. Names, ages. The city where Evan had signed his own set of papers, the approximate time between Damien's donation and the twins' birth. Every answer slotted into place with unnerving ease. The coincidence that might have offered them an escape crumbled under simple arithmetic. Evan's instinct was to retreat, to pull his boys away and disappear into the anonymity of the city before this man could decide what he wanted from them. He could feel his body leaning back even as his feet stayed rooted. His hands itched to reach for his sons, to snap, "Let go, we are leaving." But the twins had already mapped Damien as safe in their nervous systems. Theo refused to be moved until the Alpha himself shifted with him, small fingers tightening whenever Evan tugged. Jamie, usually braver and more independent, kept glancing up at Damien's face, as if cataloging every micro-expression, every flicker of feeling. Their bodies betrayed a familiarity that had no social explanation. They should not have felt this anchored to a stranger they had just met. But to them, he was not entirely a stranger. Some part of them recognized him the way seeds recognize a particular kind of soil. To pull them away now felt to Evan like tearing them out by the roots. By the time the gala ended and the last guests drifted out into the night, the shock had settled into something colder, denser. The chandelier lights dimmed, staff stacked chairs, gathered linens, mopped up spilled drinks. In a corner office, under the pretense of clarifying logistics and liability, contact information was exchanged, email addresses, phone numbers, the name of a lawyer on the firm's side, the name of a pediatrician on Evan's. It all sounded so neutral, so reasonable. Evan went home with his sons, their small bodies finally heavy with sleep against his shoulders, heads lolling as the taxi turned corners. He carried them up the stairs one by one, laid them carefully in their shared bed, and stood for a moment listening to their breaths even out. Only when he was sure they were deeply asleep did he sit at the edge of his own bed and pull out the thin, worn folder from the drawer. The donor file printout, edges softened from being handled too many times in the past, lay open in his lap. Age, heritage, health, the blurred photograph, the line about no future contact. For years it had been just a safety choice, a way to build a family without opening the door to another person's power. Now, every line hummed with new meaning. The anonymous Alpha in the document had a name, a scent, a temper held tight behind his teeth, and a presence strong enough to alter the trajectory of their lives with a single decision. Evan stared at the page, then closed his eyes, and saw instead the image from the ballroom. Damien standing with two boys pressed to his side, as if the file had climbed out of the clinic's server and become flesh. This is real now, he thought, a cold, clear thread of understanding running through the fear. He is real now. And there was no going back to a world where the donor was just ink on paper. For days after the gala, Damien tried to treat the encounter like any other anomaly in his schedule, an error to be logged and corrected. He woke at his usual hour, went to the gym, skimmed reports over black coffee. He attended meetings, signed documents, reviewed contracts with the same steady hand. When his assistants glanced at him, they saw no change. If anything, he seemed more focused, more clipped, as if efficiency alone could erase what had happened. He told himself that the night with the twins was an administrative oversight, nothing more. The clinic had mishandled confidentiality. Someone had broken procedure. It could be resolved with a firm conversation, a legal threat, an adjustment to protocols. He repeated that line in his head like a mantra, but the memory of two small bodies pressing against his side refused to fade. It surfaced between agenda items, in the lift, in the quiet seconds between one phone call and the next. The weight of a small hand fisted in his suit. The way their scent had settled around him like it belonged there. Eventually, words and routines were not enough. Damien requested his old donor records under the careful language of legal review. The clinic responded in the only way they knew how. A sealed envelope, a printed report, a sanitized letter reminding him that all donations had been processed under full consent and in compliance with regulations. The list of conceptions resulting from his sample was heavily redacted, names blacked out, dates blurred. But not everything was erased. One entry lined up with cold precision against what he already knew. A single Omega client, no partner listed. Twin pregnancy carried to term in the exact year that matched the boys. There it was in print, a few clinical lines that anchored his uneasy suspicions into fact. He stared at the page for a long time, thumb pressed against the paper until the edge dug into his skin. The knowledge struck deeper than he wanted to admit. For years, Damien had told himself that he did not want children because they complicated everything. Children were unpredictable, loud, needy. They demanded explanations he did not have and emotional transparency he did not possess. They turned clean schedules into fragile guesses. That had been the story he told the world. Underneath that, less examined, was a more private fear he rarely let himself look at. Any child of his would inherit not only his genes, but all the expectations that had nearly broken him. He remembered being a young heir, his life measured in grades, wins, polished performances. Praise came like a ration, always tied to achievement. Punishment followed any deviation from the family image. He had learned young how to smooth his face, slow his breathing, lock his softness away. The idea of repeating that pattern, even unintentionally, was unbearable. He had decided long ago that the safest way to avoid becoming his father was simple: never be a father at all. He thought he had solved the problem by refusing bonds, refusing family, refusing the script altogether. Now, without his permission, without his awareness, two children existed who were his in the most undeniable way possible. They had his scent notes and his bone structure. They had his jawline and his tendency to go very still when overwhelmed. They had grown up outside of his carefully controlled world, in a small apartment with an overworked Omega who had shielded them from the worst of systemic pressure. They had not been shaped by the Vale family's cold standards or by his own emotional distance. They had walked into a room full of alphas, and out of everyone, had chosen him. Chosen with their feet in their hands and their nervous systems, long before any adult said the word father. Chosen the one man in the building who had sworn never to be chosen like that. His initial response was to pull back. Distance was the tool he trusted. He told himself that the best thing he could do was ensure their financial security from afar. Quietly, he had his legal team check whether the clinic had breached any agreements. Memos were drafted. Phrases like structural risk and liability exposure appeared in emails. He considered filing a lawsuit that might scare them into tightening procedures that might make sure such a near encounter never happened again. At the same time, He instructed his financial advisor to start building a fund that could cover the twins' education and basic needs without his name ever appearing on a public document. Anonymous trusts, indirect channels, all of it allowed him to maintain the illusion that he was acting responsibly without stepping into the role of a parent. He could be a benefactor, he told himself, a distant safeguard, not a father, never that, but the twins refused to stay theoretical. Paperwork could be kept at arm's length, living children could not. Evan, pushed by practical needs and subtle pressure from preschool staff and doctors who wanted a complete family history, agreed to a few cautious meetings. Medical information, they said, formal responsibilities, clarifying boundaries. It all sounded clinical, containable. Each time Damien sat across from them in neutral spaces, chosen to keep anyone from having too much home advantage. A clinic office with pale walls and rounded furniture. A playroom at a community center where the air smelled of crayons and disinfectant. A quiet corner of a park where adults could talk while children ran on the grass. Each time, the boys navigated around him less like they would around a stranger and more like someone they had always been supposed to know. Jamie began to show him drawings without prompting, pictures where there were 3 tall figures and 2 small ones, all with the same dark hair and similar eyes. He would slap the paper down with that blunt confidence only young children had and announce, "This is us," as if the world had always looked that way. Theo, more cautious, started to relax only when Damien was in the room. In group spaces, his shoulders dropped a fraction when that familiar scent reached him. His hands, which often twisted in the hem of his shirt around strangers, went still if Damien sat nearby. It was as if some part of him could finally rest once the strongest scent in his environment belonged to someone he trusted. For a man who had built his entire adult life around not being needed, the sensation of being instinctively leaned on in this way was both terrifying and addictive. It pressed against old wounds and old vows. It also lit up something he had not known was still there, a fierce, wordless drive to protect what was his, not in the sense of ownership, but in the sense of responsibility. The war inside Damien intensified. One side lined up every logical reason to keep his distance. His career depended on his focus. His emotional history made him a poor candidate for soft roles. He did not know how to speak gently when scared. He did not know how to be patient when tired. If he stepped closer and failed them, that failure would cut deeper than anything he had done in business. The other side replayed over and over the moment in the ballroom when 2 small bodies had pressed against him without hesitation and his instincts had responded before his mind did. It replayed the hospital file with the redacted lines and the one entry that matched the twins perfectly. It replayed the sight of Theo settling when he entered a room, of Jamie shoving a drawing into his hands as if it were obvious that Damien belonged in it. Blood did not care about legal shields or personal vows. Paper could erase his name from a birth certificate, but it could not erase the way his scent wrapped around these children or the way they quieted under his hand. Whether he liked it or not, a piece of him lived in those 2 boys, and they had already recognized it. The only question left was whether he would continue pretending not to see them or admit that the war he was fighting was not really with them at all, but with the ghost of the man who had raised him. While Damien wrestled with his internal battle, Evan kept moving because he did not have the luxury of stopping. His days were not built out of questions about ethics and bloodlines, but out of preschool drop-offs, freelance assignments, grocery trips, and last-minute calls from teachers about forgotten items. His life was a collage of small urgencies, taped together by habit and caffeine. Morning began with alarms that felt too early, and boys who always woke up slightly too late. He coaxed 2 sleepy bodies out of bed, negotiated over which shirt did not itch, which socks did not feel wrong on Theo's skin, which toy car Jamie absolutely had to bring in his pocket. Breakfast was quick and repetitive. Toast, fruit when he could afford it, cereal on the days when his brain could not manage more. Then the rush of jackets, shoes, backpacks, the 3 flights of stairs, the short walk to preschool with one boy skipping ahead and the other clinging to his arm. Preschool drop-off was its own small performance. Other parents chatted in clusters, exchanging weekend stories and arranging playdates. Evan signed forms at the counter, checked the notice board for new announcements, and tried not to hear the question in some of the glances. "Just you again?" He kissed each boy on the forehead, breathed in their scents like a grounding ritual, and left them in a room that always felt slightly too loud, trusting teachers to be enough until he could come back. Then, the day splintered into tasks. He took the bus across town to meet a client at a hotel lobby, laptop balanced on his knees. He answered emails while standing in line at the supermarket, calculating prices under his breath. A freelance assignment for the event company needed edits. A catering vendor wanted confirmation. A colleague texted asking if he could cover part of a shift later in the week. Every yes he gave meant a little more money and a little less energy left. At night, when the twins were finally asleep, when the apartment had fallen into that fragile quiet that felt almost sacred, he sometimes allowed himself a few minutes to think about the new element in their lives. Those minutes rarely made him feel better. Sitting at the cramped kitchen table with his hands around a mug that had gone cold, he replayed the image of the ballroom, of his sons pressed against Damien's side, of the way the Alpha's presence had steadied them. The thought moved like a stone in his stomach. Meeting Damien had thrown his sense of control into disarray. For years, he'd designed his world around one stable equation. He was the only parent his boys had. Every decision, every resource, every sacrifice was calculated with that in mind. What preschool they attended, what neighborhood they lived in, which jobs he could accept and which he had to refuse. It had all been weighed against his availability to them. The donor at the clinic had been a ghost, a convenient narrative that allowed his sons to feel wanted without having to face the reality of someone who had not chosen them in person. He had crafted a story out of neutral phrases, a kind alpha who helped them be born. No promises, no faces, no scent. Now that ghost had become a real man who sat across from them at small tables and looked at the boys with a kind of wary attention that Evan did not know how to interpret. He feared the obvious things first, that Damien would decide, suddenly and absolutely, to fight for custody. That courts and systems, so often tilted toward alphas with money and status, would default to the narrative that the twins would be better off in a large, stable, wealthy home. That his sons would be pulled into a world where he had no authority, where his role would be reduced to weekend visits and polite updates. The thought made his chest tighten, breath catching somewhere high in his throat, but he also feared the subtler shifts, the ones that wore grooves in a life slowly, rather than breaking it all at once. Jamie's stories began to include the tall man who always smelled calm, a background presence in adventures he drew in crayon. Theo, normally wary of new adults, began to reach for Damien's presence with a quiet, instinctive certainty, as if his nervous system had found a missing piece and did not intend to let it go. Evan could not compete with biology, and he knew it. No matter how many nights he stayed up with them, no matter how many scraped knees he cleaned or monsters under the bed he banished, there was something in the way their bodies relaxed around Damien that was beyond his control. He did not resent them for it. He resented the universe a little, and himself a lot, for believing he could keep genetics in a folder forever. Practical concerns did not pause while his heart worried itself raw. The twins' preschool demanded updated medical forms, and some of them now required information about genetic conditions from both parents. For safety, the administrator said, apologetic but firm. A minor accident on the playground, just a fall from a climbing frame and a cut that bled more than expected, raised questions about blood types and emergency contacts. Each instance pushed Evan closer to acknowledging that keeping Damien entirely outside their paperwork was no longer feasible. At the same time, he noticed things about Damien that did not fit the caricature of a cold alpha he had built in his head as protection. The man showed up to meetings on time, even when his schedule was clearly packed. He listened carefully when medical professionals explained Theo's sensory sensitivities, asking specific questions without implying blame. He never spoke over Evan in front of the boys, never dismissed his experience as a single parent with a careless wave. His manners were sparse but precise, like someone who had learned the hard way how much harm careless authority could do. Evan started to realize that he was not the only one held together by exhaustion. Damien carried his own bone-deep tiredness, hidden under expensive fabrics and perfect posture. You could see it in the way his shoulders dropped slightly when he thought no one was looking, in the way he sometimes rubbed at the bridge of his nose as if fighting off an old headache. For Evan, exhaustion came from stretching himself too thin for his children, from giving more than he had every day and hoping it would be enough. For Damien, it seemed to come from a lifetime of resisting a script written for him by other people, of pushing back against expectations until his muscles forgot how to rest. The twins, without understanding any of this, moved between them as if testing the strength of each man's presence. They fell asleep against Evan's chest, trusting that he would wake up if they had a nightmare. They reached for Damien's hand in busy corridors, trusting that he would make space around them. Their small bodies were measuring reliability long before anyone wrote it down. Every new small crisis exposed another gap in Evan's defenses. When one of the boys developed a sudden fever during a shift, it was Damien's contact at a private clinic who made sure they were seen quickly, skipping a waiting list Evan would never have been able to bypass. When a preschool administrator implied, with a tight smile, that a proper family structure would make certain paperwork easier, it was Damien's concise email that clarified the legal standing of their arrangement and warned, politely but unmistakably, against discrimination. Each intervention made Evan feel both grateful and more entangled. Grateful because his children were safer with that kind of backup behind them. Entangled because every time Damien stepped in, it became harder to maintain the story that he was just a name on a donor file. The anonymous alpha from the clinic had become a living variable in every equation Evan tried to balance, and his own life, held together by exhaustion and stubbornness, now had another pair of hands tugging at its edges, whether he wanted them there or not. The breaking point did not arrive as a dramatic catastrophe, but as something small and ordinary. It began on a weekday afternoon when Theo came home from preschool quieter than usual. He dropped his backpack just inside the door and sat down without his usual ritual of lining up toy cars. When Evan asked about his day, Theo shrugged, rubbed his leg, and said it hurt. Leg pain, a little fatigue, nothing that screamed disaster. Easily filed under growth spurt, too much running, not enough water. By evening, the picture had shifted. Theo was pale in a way that did not match a simple, tired mood. His eyes looked shadowed. He pushed away his dinner after 2 forced bites, then curled up on the couch, head in Evan's lap. The warmth under Evan's hand was wrong, heavy and persistent. He tried home remedies first because that was what you did when money was tight and clinics were far. A cool cloth on Theo's forehead, fluids, a story and a soft voice. The thermometer, cheap and temperamental, confirmed what his skin already knew, a fever that refused to drop. Evan's instincts, trained over years of pretending everything was fine until it very clearly was not, screamed that something else was going on. Parents told themselves not to overreact. Single parents learned not to overreact because every emergency threatened their livelihood. But watching Theo's chest rise and fall too fast, feeling the way his small fingers twitched with restless discomfort, Evan hit the point where fear outweighed budgeting. The emergency room was a hard contrast to their dim apartment. Fluorescent lights flattened every face into something colorless. The air smelled of antiseptic, old coffee, and the metallic bite of stress. People sat hunched in chairs, holding injured arms, cradling crying toddlers, staring at phones as if answers could be found there. Evan registered their presence in a blur as he checked Theo in, repeating details to the triage nurse, trying to make his voice sound steady. Doctors and nurses moved in practiced patterns, like a choreography he had not been invited to rehearse. They took vitals, noted the fever that clung stubbornly, the complaints about leg pain, the fatigue that seemed heavier than the numbers alone could explain. Theo, usually sensitive to new environments, lay unusually still on the narrow bed, watching the overhead lights with glassy eyes. Jamie sat on a plastic chair, unnaturally quiet, one hand wrapped around Theo's foot as if anchoring him. Tests were ordered. Blood, of course, swabs, samples that disappeared into the inner machinery of the hospital. Explanations followed, but they blurred together in Evan's exhausted mind. Words washed over him in waves, viral, bacterial, markers, observation. Then, one word cut through the haze with surgical precision. Marrow. They were not sure yet, the doctor said carefully, but there were markers that concerned them. Further testing was required. If certain diagnoses were confirmed, A close genetic match might be necessary for specific treatments. In that case, they would need to test immediate family members as potential donors. Immediate family. The phrase echoed uncomfortably in the small curtained space. For years, that had meant Evan alone. On every form, in every system, he had been the only parent listed. Now, whether he liked it or not, there was someone else whose blood ran closer to Theo's than his own. Someone he had tried to keep in the realm of theory and legal boundaries. Medical staff, following protocol and not the complicated realities of their lives, asked about the other parent. The question landed like a weight in Evan's chest. For a handful of seconds that felt like hours, he hesitated, caught between old promises of anonymity and the sight of his son's too pale face. Then, the choice stripped itself down to something brutally simple. Paper versus child. He gave Damien's name. Confidentiality clauses and clinic agreements shrank in importance next to lab results and the doctor's concerned eyes. Whatever the donor contract had once promised, Theo's body was rewriting the rules. Damien arrived at the hospital with the efficiency of someone used to responding to crisis. The automatic doors opened, letting in a rush of cold air and the faint trace of his controlled alpha scent. He did not waste time on greeting rituals. He asked which floor, which ward, which room. He moved through corridors as if they were office hallways, but his jaw was tight in a way his colleagues had never seen. In the room, he listened to the doctors, read the charts, and submitted to tests without protest, sleeves rolled up, veins offered. Consent forms were signed quickly, his signature sharp and decisive at the bottom of each page. Blood was drawn into vials labeled with Theo's name and his own. The wait for results stretched, filled with the soft beeping of machines and the rustle of hospital sheets. When the report finally came, it carried the kind of clarity that erased any remaining room for doubt. Damien was not just a compatible donor. He was, genetically, the closest possible match. The science on the page confirmed what scent and instinct had known in the ballroom. Even the cautious doctor's voice softened as he explained it. In the small space of that hospital room, legal fictions and psychological defenses collapsed. Evan watched as Theo's fingers, searching in his sleep, found Damien's wrist and curled around it, as if his body recognized the rhythm of that pulse as home. Jamie hovered near the bed, torn between clinging to his Omega parent and orbiting the Alpha, whose presence made the doctors relax a fraction. Medical staff adjusted their language without even thinking about it. They began to speak to both men as parents, dividing eye contact between them when explaining next steps. No one asked who held what title. The chart now listed two fathers. The system, indifferent to their carefully constructed emotional distance, accepted that as fact. The emergency, mercifully, did not turn into the worst-case scenario. After tense days of evaluation and watching numbers rise and fall on monitors, the doctors ruled out conditions that would require immediate invasive procedures. The specter of marrow transplants retreated into the background. Theo responded to treatment, color returning gradually, fever easing, but the process had already forced them through a door that could not be closed. Official records now connected Theo directly to Damien. Hospital systems would not simply forget that there were two paternal names in his chart. Insurance files, appointment logs, follow-up notes, all of it now carried the imprint of a family structure they had not planned. For Damien, the experience destroyed the last thin layer of emotional distance he thought he could maintain. Watching a small body on a hospital bed, tethered to machines that beeped with every heartbeat, he realized that his fear of children had never been about disliking them. It had always been panic at the idea of failing someone who depended on him completely. In the quiet hours by Theo's side, while the boy slept with his hand still resting on Damien's arm, his old vow against family felt less like a shield and more like an avoidance strategy that had reached its limit. Evan, sitting in a hard plastic chair between the two beds where his son slept, understood that the choice was no longer between secrecy and openness. The truth had already written itself into their medical history and into the boys' nervous systems. His sons had already decided, in their bodies, who was safe. The only decision left was whether to keep fighting something that had become undeniable, or to find a way to structure it so that his children were not the ones paying the highest price for the adult's fear. News traveled quickly in circles where every shift in personal life could signal a shift in power. The first whispers started with scheduling anomalies. Damien's assistants noticed pediatric specialists appearing on his calendar, squeezed between board meetings and negotiations. A new hospital number appeared on his emergency contact list. His location pings, once a predictable triangle between office, penthouse, and client sites, started to include late-night visits to a children's ward. They knew better than to gossip openly. His office ran on quiet competence, not rumor, but information leaked in softer ways. A raised eyebrow exchanged over a shared screen. A half-sentence dropped in the break room. He left the office early and went to the hospital again. With toys. Toys, in a sentence about Damien Vale, landed like a thrown stone in still water. Within weeks, a rumor solidified into a narrative. Damien Vale, the man who had, on more than one occasion, stated in interviews that he would never have a family, had been seen leaving a pediatric wing late at night. Someone mentioned twins. Someone else mentioned an omega, always in the hesitant tone people used when they were not sure if they were crossing a line. Shareholders, ever alert to changes that might affect a key partner's stability, began to inquire. Their concern came wrapped in neutral phrases. Was he taking on too much outside the firm? Did he anticipate any impact on his workload? Potential clients, reading the same signs, expressed their worries in coded language about focus and long-term commitment. "We hope your priorities remain aligned with the project," they said, as if a child's fever might directly threaten a merger. The pressure did not stop there. Damien's estranged family, who had long criticized his refusal to marry into another prominent line, suddenly rediscovered an interest in his personal life. They could accept a son who treated relationships like temporary accessories so long as he stayed available for strategic matches. A son who might have created heirs outside of their control was another matter. Invitations to talk things through began to arrive. Thinly disguised summonses framed as family concern. Handwritten notes, rare in his life now, appeared among business correspondence. Dinners were suggested at restaurants his parents favored for discreet conversations. The subtext was clear. If there were children, they belonged folded into the family brand or erased quietly. In parallel, Evan felt the ripple effects from his own side of the social map. Preschool staff, having seen Damien at the hospital and at follow-up meetings, adjusted their tone. Some became more respectful, suddenly eager to discuss individual learning plans and inclusive practices. Others grew more cautious, words chosen carefully, as if afraid to say the wrong thing in front of someone connected to a powerful alpha. Parents at the playground cast new, curious glances when Damien joined them on rare afternoons. Before, Evan had been filed under single omega, doing his best, slightly overwhelmed. Now, with a tall, self-contained alpha occasionally at his side, assumptions shifted. Conversations grew sticky with curiosity. "So, this is—" someone would start, letting the question hang. Evan answered in the simplest way possible. "Their father." The word felt both too big and exactly right. The boys, sensitive to shifts in adult behavior, even when they did not understand the reasons, picked up on the tension. Teachers' sense sharpened when Damien entered a room. Other children's parents suddenly smiled more brightly or looked away a little too quickly. Even at home, the air felt different some evenings, a little thicker, as Evan and Damien tried to talk logistics without brushing against the raw edges of everything unspoken. At the center of this expanding circle of consequences, the twins simply kept doing what they had from the beginning: choosing. They chose to sit next to Damien during medical consultations, even when Evan was in the room. Theo's small hand would seek out his sleeve when a nurse prepared a needle, eyes fixed on his face for cues. Jamie, restless and brave, would lean against Damien's side while listening to doctors, as if borrowing steadiness. They chose to include him in drawings and stories without checking whether it was socially appropriate. Their crayon families almost always showed 3 tall figures now, not 2. In their narratives about their day, the tall man slowly shifted into dad when they forgot to censor themselves. Their nervous systems had made their decision long before any adult finished weighing pros and cons. The question that remained was not whether Damien was their father, That had already been answered in charts and everyday interactions, in blood test results and the way the boys' bodies relaxed when he walked into a room. The question was whether he would claim that role out loud in a world that would not let him do so halfway. The cost of a public mine was high. It meant renegotiating contracts that assumed his total availability. It meant recalibrating expectations at the firm, accepting that there would be evenings he would leave for a school performance instead of a networking dinner. It meant risking the trust of people who had built entire strategies around his predictability as an unattached, unencumbered alpha. Some would see his choice as a sign of weakness. Others would try to use his children as leverage. For a man who had once signed away his genetic rights to avoid exactly this scenario, the irony was not lost. He had paid to prevent his blood from binding him. He had used anonymity as a wall. Now he was contemplating stepping willingly into entanglement that went far beyond any contract. One path promised minimal professional fallout and preservation of his old life, at the cost of turning his back on two boys whose shoulders dropped, whose breathing eased whenever he entered a room. The other path meant letting the world see him as something other than unbreakable and unattached. It meant being known as a father, with all the perceived vulnerability that title carried in his circles. It meant introducing unpredictability into his own carefully managed existence and trusting that he would not repeat the damage his own parents had done. Evan watched this internal battle with a mixture of dread and reluctant empathy. He knew what it cost to rearrange your life around children. He lived that cost every day. He also knew what it meant to be the one left behind by someone who would not. Sitting at his kitchen table while the boys slept, he could imagine both endings too clearly. He could not make the decision for Damien. He would not beg, and he would not push him toward a role he did not truly choose. All he could do was hold his sons when they climbed into his lap, listen when they spoke about the tall man with the calm scent, and silently hope that whatever choice the alpha made, it would not teach them that they were a mistake someone regretted. Because that was the deepest cost of all. Not the contracts, not the reputations, not the shareholders' whispers. It was the risk that two small boys might learn from the way adults behaved that their very existence was too expensive to claim in public. The turning point came not in a courtroom or a boardroom, but in a quiet office where the walls were lined with books instead of trophies. The chairs were soft, the lighting deliberately gentle, and there was a low shelf with neatly arranged toys in one corner. At the recommendation of a pediatric specialist, and under the weight of everything that had happened at the hospital, they found themselves sitting opposite a family therapist who specialized in non-traditional dynamics and Omegaverse-specific attachment. The first sessions felt like being asked to walk barefoot over unfamiliar ground. Damien sat with his back too straight, suit jacket on, even when offered a coat rack, answering questions in clipped, efficient sentences. He was not accustomed to speaking about anything he could not control, and certainly not about his childhood. Every time the conversation drifted in that direction, his jaw tightened, like someone bracing for impact. Evan, in contrast, folded into himself. He chose the chair closest to the door, as if some part of him still expected to have to leave suddenly for a school call or a shift. He was used to managing alone, to presenting a version of himself that said, "I have this handled." Admitting the depth of his fear, the nights spent counting bills and breaths, asking for help from someone who was not directly tied to his children's immediate survival, went against years of training. The twins were invited into some of the sessions through play-based observation. While the adults talked in low voices, Theo and Jamie were given blocks, dolls, crayons. They revealed more with their bodies than with their words. Theo consistently placed himself between the two adults, touching both as if stitching them together into something that held. When Damien and Evan sat farther apart, Theo's game pieces migrated back and forth, little characters visiting one another until the distance shrank. Jamie gravitated toward whichever adult seemed most regulated that day. On afternoons when Damien arrived carrying the tension of boardroom battles, shoulders sharp and scent tight, Jamie drifted toward Evan, orbiting close to his tired but familiar warmth. On days when Evan was frayed, eyes shadowed from too many late nights, Jamie watched Damien carefully, and if the alpha's breathing stayed steady, he edged closer, testing the reliability of that calm. Without meaning to, he pointed out who, in that moment, was strong enough to be leaned on. Through questions and careful reflections, the therapist helped them begin to untangle their stories. Damien, for the first time in years, put words to things he had always treated as private data. He spoke about a father who measured love in achievements and a mother who treated weakness as betrayal. He described holidays where expensive gifts were placed on the table, followed later by subtle reminders of what was expected in return. He remembered being told, in not so many words, that children existed to carry legacies, not to be messy, frightened humans. Somewhere along the way, he had decided that the only way to avoid inflicting that dynamic on someone else was simple: never have anyone who could call him father. His vow against family, spoken so confidently in interviews, began to look less like a principle and more like a shield. Evan shared his own path in pieces, sometimes stopping mid-sentence to glance at the boys as if checking whether he was saying too much. He talked about partners who had promised partnership and vanished when pregnancy became real. About standing alone in a clinic, signing forms with shaking hands because anonymity felt safer than asking someone to stay. He admitted quietly that part of him had preferred a faceless donor, because a real alpha with real feelings could hurt them in ways a file could not. It was easier to be angry at a system than at a person sitting in front of you, holding your child's hand. The twins, in their own way, showed what they needed most. They needed consistency more than perfection. They needed sensory safety, predictable sense, routines that did not shift without warning, voices that did not explode. They needed adults who did not use them as proof of anything, who did not hold them up as symbols in family battles or corporate narratives. They did not care about donor contracts, legacy plans, or public image. They cared that someone came when they cried, that sense in the house did not disappear for weeks without explanation, that arguments between adults did not turn rooms into storms. In those sessions, the concept of family quietly shifted shape. It stopped being a predefined structure loaded with inherited pain and rigid expectations. It became, instead, a series of choices made again and again. Who would show up for school concerts? Who would hold the thermometer at 3 a.m. and stay awake until the numbers dropped? Who would listen when a child tried to put fear into clumsy words? The therapist did not tell them what configuration they should choose. She did not hand them a model and say, "This is the right one." She only asked, gently and insistently, whether the old definitions they were clinging to were protecting anyone or just repeating harm they had already survived. When Damien insisted he was not cut out to be a father, she asked whose standards he was measuring himself against. When Evan said he was afraid of being replaced, she asked whether his boys acted like he was optional. For Damien, this reframing was unsettling and liberating at once. He realized that his vow never to have children had been a blunt instrument. It had shielded him from vulnerability, yes, but it had also shielded him from any possibility of doing things differently. The twins had already forced him to see that biology did not have to equal control. He could be a father without becoming his own father. He could share responsibility without turning it into ownership. He could learn, slowly, that saying mine did not have to mean you belong to me. It could also mean I am choosing to be responsible for you. Evan, listening to all of this, felt some of his own defenses soften in ways that scared him. He saw that letting Damien into their lives more fully did not automatically mean giving up his role or handing his children over to a colder world. It could mean giving them access to another adult who was learning, painfully and consciously, how not to repeat old patterns. That did not erase the risk of disappointment, but it also opened the door to something he had quietly wanted for them and never said out loud: more than one safe adult to lean on. In that small, book-lined office, family stopped being the script they had inherited and became the story they might write themselves if they were brave enough to keep showing up. The decision, when it came, was not a single grand gesture, but a sequence of deliberate disruptions to the life Damien had built. There was no moment of standing on a metaphorical cliff and proclaiming anything. Instead, there was a series of calendar entries, signatures, and sentences spoken in rooms that had never heard him talk about anything personal. He started with the firm because that was where most of his power and most of his fear lived. Damien called a meeting with the senior partners and, for once, did not allow it to be rescheduled around other people's emergencies. The conference room, usually a stage for mergers and acquisitions, felt different with his personal history laid out between the water glasses and spreadsheets. He explained the situation with the same clarity he used for complex deals, minus his usual emotional armor. There were 2 children in the city, twins, who carried his genetics and his name on medical forms. Their existence was no longer theoretical. Their images already appeared in hospital records tied to his profile. He told them that he intended to be present in their lives, not as a donor in the background, but as a parent in the foreground. Reactions slid across familiar faces in unfamiliar ways. Surprise, curiosity, thinly veiled concern, some worried about distractions, about what it would mean if the man who had always been available suddenly had evenings blocked off for school events. Others talked about optics, how markets and clients liked their alpha negotiators to appear unencumbered. A few hinted carefully that clients might prefer the old version of him, the one who lived only for the firm. For the first time in his career, Damien did not adjust his plan to make other people more comfortable. When someone suggested he keep things discreet for now, he listened in silence, then said, "I will not treat my children like a liability." The sentence landed in the room like a crack in glass. He made it clear, without raising his voice, that anyone who saw his involvement with his sons as weakness had fundamentally misunderstood the kind of strength he intended to bring into negotiations from now on. Strength that could walk into a boardroom after spending the night in a hospital chair and still refuse a bad deal. Strength that had something more important than quarterly numbers to measure risk against. Legally, he moved to formalize what reality had already established. Papers were filed recognizing his paternity, not as a weapon to seize custody, but as a shield to protect the twins and Evan if anything happened to him. He refused to let them remain, on paper, as children of a single parent with no legal backup. Custody agreements were drafted with unusual care. Instead of defaulting to standard alternating schedules, they structured time around the boys' needs, around Theo's sensory patterns, Jamie's need for predictable change, their school routines, their capacity to handle transitions without feeling abandoned. Evan's role as primary caregiver was explicitly recognized. Damien's role as an involved co-parent was clearly defined in language that emphasized responsibility, not ownership. Publicly, he allowed the story to exist without turning it into a brand. There were no interviews about discovering fatherhood, no glossy photo shoots with staged domesticity. He did not mention the twins in investor calls, did not weave them into speeches, but he also stopped pretending they did not exist. Colleagues began to see small backpacks in the corner of his office on certain afternoons, sneakers tucked neatly beside his polished shoes. Assistants learned that some evenings were blocked out months in advance for school performances or parent-teacher meetings, and that those entries were not to be moved. The firm, slowly and with some friction, adjusted to the idea that their most formidable partner also sometimes left a meeting 5 minutes early to make it to a classroom on time. For the twins, the changes were more concrete and immediate. Weekends began to include trips to places they had never been able to go before, a science museum where they could press buttons and make lights flash without anyone shushing them, a park on the edge of the city where the air smelled cleaner and the ground was wide enough for running without constant warnings about cars. It was not about luxury. It was about room to be loud and small and alive. Evenings in Damien's apartment, once silent and meticulously organized, shifted. The sharp edges of minimalism softened under a thin layer of child reality. Building blocks migrated under coffee tables. A small dinosaur appeared inexplicably on a high shelf. One of his expensive throw pillows developed a permanent crease where Jamie liked to sit. The scent of carefully chosen child-safe soap began to mingle with his usual restrained cologne, settling into the fabric of the place. Evan watched all of this with cautious hope, the kind that hurt a little. He stood in doorways and saw Damien struggling sometimes, caught between old reflexes and new intentions. The alpha's irritation flared, and then was pulled back when Theo's hands clapped over his ears at a raised tone. There were evenings when Damien stepped out onto the balcony, shoulders tight, to breathe through the aftermath of a tantrum or a challenging day. but he always returned. He apologized when he snapped, the words awkward at first, then more natural. He listened when Evan shared what had worked and what had failed in the years before he arrived. He learned how the twins liked their routines signposted, how much notice they needed before a change. Slowly, the boys began to trust that this presence was not another temporary visitor whose scent would vanish suddenly from their world. The most significant choice Damien made was internal and invisible. He stopped framing his involvement as repayment of a debt to genetics or as damage control for a breached contract. Instead, he began to think of it as a daily decision to stand in the light with his sons, even when the light was unflattering, even when it showed him his own flaws. He allowed himself to be someone they could call father without flinching at the word. He learned to sign permission slips and medical forms with a steady hand, not because he was obliged to, but because he wanted his name there. The man who had once signed away parental rights to avoid being trapped was now choosing, repeatedly, to be bound by 3 smaller signatures: Theo, Jamie, and Evan's unspoken trust that he would keep showing up. Time did what it always did when people kept choosing to show up. It took the sharp edges of the crisis and pushed them into the background, turning emergencies into reference points instead of definitions. Months passed, then about a year. Seasons shifted in small domestic markers rather than on calendars. First day of school with 2 adults standing at the gate, one holding a coffee cup too tightly, the other pretending not to be as composed as he seemed. Winter evenings with hot chocolate spilled on expensive rugs and no one really caring because the boys were laughing. Spring afternoons at playgrounds where strangers tried to guess which adult was the real parent, and the twins answered in the only way that mattered by pulling both men into their games. Damien's apartment, once a calculated monument to minimalist efficiency, evolved without a formal decision. The clean lines and quality furniture remained, but they no longer dominated the space. A low shelf appeared with picture books lined up in chaotic order. The dining table permanently hosted an art station, a territory of crayons, blunt scissors, and paper speckled with glue that never quite washed off. One of the sofa cushions developed a visible dent where Theo liked to curl up with a blanket, and Damien stopped smoothing it out. The scent of home shifted too. It no longer smelled only of polished wood, coffee, and restrained musk. Now there was laundry detergent clinging to small t-shirts, the waxy smell of crayons, the faint sweetness of shampoo after evening baths. On some nights, the air carried traces of rain-soaked sneakers left too close to the radiator and the warm, indefinable smell of children who had spent a long day running, thinking, feeling too much. Evan's life changed as well, in ways that were less photogenic, but no less real. Sharing responsibility did not magically erase financial stress. Bills still arrived, shoes were still outgrown faster than seemed fair, but the edges softened. There were fewer nights where he lay awake calculating whether he could afford both preschool supplies and doctor visits. There were more mornings where someone else could handle pouring cereal while he actually drank a full cup of coffee sitting down. More than the practical relief, there was emotional space. Space to remember that he existed as more than a caretaker. Space to feel tired without immediate panic about what would fall apart if he rested. On some evenings, when the twins were at Damien's and the apartment was too quiet, he sat with a book or music and felt something almost unfamiliar. The sense that his life belonged to him again, in small, reclaimable pieces. Between the 2 men, something grew that had not been part of any original plan. It did not start with declarations or dramatic confessions. It began with small, consistent acts that left traces. Damien learning how Evan liked his tea and making it that way automatically. Evan noticing when Damien went too still and steering conversations away from topics that tightened his throat. Shared glances over the twins' heads when one of them said something unexpectedly wise or hilariously strange, the kind of look that said, "Did you hear that? We are raising these people together." Trust built itself slowly, like a structure designed to withstand more than one kind of weather. There were arguments, because there always were when people cared. About bedtimes, about screen time, about whose work could bend more easily on a given week. But the arguments ended with adjustments rather than exits. Each time someone came back to the table after cooling off, the foundation thickened. The twins, as always, led the way without knowing they were doing it. They created rituals that assumed both men existed in the same orbit, good-night routines that included two different kinds of hugs, one fierce and tight, one lingering and gentle. Weekend breakfasts where each adult had a specific role. One flipped pancakes with surgical precision, the other burned the first batch and made everyone laugh. School projects where they announced without hesitation that they would ask both their parents for help, because one is good at cutting straight and one is good at not giving up. Their nervous systems no longer went into panic when 1 cent vanished for a day. Experience had taught them that people could go out into the world and still come back. The old terror of disappearance, born from years when Evan had been the only fixed point, loosened its grip. In their world, the alpha who once said he hated children was simply the parent who read the more dramatic bedtime stories in a steady voice that made nightmares feel smaller. Looking back, Damien could trace the line from the night in the ballroom to the present and barely recognize the man at the beginning of it. The cold alpha who insisted he would never want kids had not been lying at the time. He truly had not wanted the kind of family he had known growing up, rigid, transactional, weaponized. What the twins had done, without speeches or arguments, was show him a different version. One where family could be noisy, inconvenient, sometimes painfully honest, and still feel like freedom instead of a prison. Evan, watching the boys tumble across a living room that now felt more like shared territory than borrowed space, saw a different story when he looked back. The choice he had made at the clinic, the years of being the only adult in every emergency, the fear of letting someone else in. None of that vanished, but it was no longer the whole picture. Now there were evenings where he leaned against a doorway and saw his sons arguing over a game while Damien mediated with more patience than he would admit to having. Moments where he realized that by risking proximity to a man who could have walked away, he had given his children a chance to learn that sometimes people stayed. The twins themselves were not concerned with how any of this looked from the outside. They measured their world in simpler metrics. Who came when they were sick? Who remembered which stuffed animal needed to be within reach at night? Who apologized when they were wrong instead of pretending they never raised their voice? In that accounting, they were rich. Two parents who were still learning, still unlearning, but not leaving. If you have stayed with this story until the end, remember that sometimes the people who shout the loudest about never wanting love or responsibility are the ones who were hurt most by the first versions they saw. It does not excuse their choices, but it explains the walls they build. Write in the comments whose decision in this story felt the strongest to you. Damien, who chose to stand with his twins in the light, Evan, who risked sharing his children with someone new, or the twins themselves, who simply followed their sense of safety until it rewrote 3 lives. Do not forget to support the channel with a like and a subscription so you do not miss the next Forbidden BL story about how even the coldest promises can melt when real connection arrives, uninvited and impossible to ignore.